Apple's new macOS Tahoe has a secret that goes beyond revitalizing Frutiger Aero, and it's a big secret that will show Apple changing their stance on a position they have held for the last 15 years, and it's going to require you to clean your Mac display a little more often than usual.
One of the design goals was when you saw it, you wanted to lick it.
No, not that. Yes, while much of the focus this week has been placed on Apple's liquid glass design and how it's bringing back more depth, character, and more fun to the user interface, there's also some interesting UI changes Apple has made on the Mac that don't really make much sense right now, unless you start looking at the bigger picture. Yes, I am here to say rather confidently that we are about to see Apple make some huge changes to the Mac. Changes like a design with a touchscreen, and the first hints at a cellular Mac. But no matter what Apple does to a future Mac, there's one thing they can never invent enough of, and that is more storage. And you don't want to pay Apple's high storage prices, and you don't want to pay for a monthly cloud data plan either. That's why I've been using the new Ugreen NAS Sync DXP 4800 Plus. It is a local network storage option that works like the cloud, but stores all of your data locally and safely on your own hard drives. And when they sent this to me, I was dreading setting it up. I was expecting a difficult setup process, but no, it was super beginner friendly with a step-by-step system that guides you through the entire setup process with its own app. And even easier to install hard drives by simply pushing and pulling the drive trays out. There's no screws or other tools for standard hard drive installation, and as a Mac user, I love that. I had everything installed in less than 5 minutes. And this can provide a lot of storage, up to 112 terabytes. That's 39 million pictures that are so easy to sort through with Ugreen's built-in AI, which actually helps you organize and categorize your photos. It also gives you download speeds of 1200 megabytes a second, or about 1 terabyte of files in just 20 minutes. It is so much faster than cloud storage. I tried uploading the same video file to Google Drive and to my Ugreen NAS, and the Ugreen NAS finished in less than half the time. I was able to watch like halfway through the video before the Google Drive one even finished uploading. So if you want to take control of your data in an easy to use, inexpensive, and fast way, check out the link in the description to get 15% off your own Ugreen NAS, and thank you to Ugreen for sponsoring this video. Now, why am I so confident that touchscreens are coming to the Mac when Apple has been so stubborn and resistant to this change? Well, I think the clues present themselves when you start to look at a few areas of the new liquid glass design. I think the most apparent visual changes come in areas like the control buttons and sliders you use to control macOS. Nothing spells this out more than just by simply opening Control Center. When you go into Control Center, you are greeted by, let's just say, some really big buttons that don't necessarily make sense on macOS. Like normally, you would use much smaller user interface elements here because you're just using a mouse cursor, which is very precise. Now, if I take my finger and actually just push it right up against the Mac screen, right against these controls, they do look like they're meant to be touched, because look how big these controls are. Even when you look at the sliders, they are operating in the same visual way that they do on iOS. If I click on the slider, I can see a big glass button appear that follows along with every movement I make with my cursor. Even pressing the volume button brings up its own slider on the top of the menu bar, which seems interesting that it's shaped exactly the same width as a finger again. I mean, you can really imagine an easy scenario where you press the volume button and then reach your finger up and then slide it to quickly change the volume. Even the toggles in the Settings app have a much bigger button than they used to in the past. Now, you could argue that Apple said their main goal with this whole 26, macOS 26, iOS 26, iPadOS 26 redesign was that they wanted to unify the software design across all of their platforms. So you could argue that Apple is just bringing visual consistency across all of their platforms with this redesign to make it easier to switch between devices. But I feel like that is kind of a lazy move from Apple here with this new layout, like exactly mimicking how it works with the iPad and iPhone without even offering like a slightly optimized version for the macOS user interface with like smaller controls that make sense when you're using a mouse. it just doesn't make sense to me. Like, why would they want to make the controls worse on a Mac? My more optimistic approach is that Apple is planning for a future where these bigger controls make sense for a touchscreen Mac. I don't have to dive into the menu bar or dig deep into the settings to really see evidence that Apple is planning for a touchscreen Mac. No, all I have to do is simply open an app, because the apps on macOS Tahoe have a very different look than they did in the previous version. Just look at the corners. They are rounded on every side like they would be on an iPad. And that looks really strange because most of the apps used to be just fully rectangular or just like a slight rounded corner. And the screens on the Mac, even though the laptops have rounded corners on the top, well, they're still rectangular on the bottom. And then if you go to the bigger displays like the Studio Display or the iMac, well, of course, they're still just a regular rectangle. So why are they adding these corners? Because right now it just does look strange when all the corners on the Mac aren't rounded. Well, first and foremost, I do think we are eventually getting a redesign of the MacBook Pro and the MacBook Air, and even the bigger displays like the iMac and the Studio Display. And I think when we see those redesigns, we're gonna see those displays have rounded corners on every edge, on the top and on the bottom of the display. But besides just a visual change to be consistent with the liquid glass design philosophy, the rounded corners also make more sense when you consider them to be bigger touch targets, because that's what they already are on iPadOS. In fact, you only have to look at the recent iPadOS 26 build to see exactly how Apple will implement touchscreen controls on the Mac, incorporating a drag of your finger on the corners to resize windows. So Apple is laying the foundation here, not just in Control Center and lazily porting that over, but they are literally giving you these rounded corners to make them more touch-friendly on the Mac. But the biggest clue by far to them adding a touchscreen has nothing to do with what they've changed here, but rather what they've already changed on the iPad. Because the change for iPadOS is it is getting a full windowed system that basically copies macOS. Now, with any iPad running iPadOS 26, you will be able to get a bunch of windows on your screen. You can move them however you want, you can resize them, and the windowing system obviously works very similarly to how it does on the Mac. There's even 3 big red, yellow, and green buttons that let you close, minimize, and maximize an app window, just like they do on the Mac. And Apple has even solved for a way to make these buttons touch-friendly, because while they appear really small when you have the windows open, just by putting your finger or your mouse cursor over these buttons, they grow bigger, letting you more easily touch them. So not only have they brought a pointier mouse to the iPad with full window controls, but they also solved a problem that bringing touch over to the Mac would result in. It would be that these touch targets are kind of too small right now, but by letting the interface elements expand, well, that would solve these issues right here on the Mac. The user interface can grow and expand depending on how you want to use it, which is kind of, strangely enough, also one of the design principles of liquid glass. However, above all else, don't take any other argument I have if you don't want to, if you don't think I made good points. I think we only have to look at Apple's stubbornness over the years about implementing a windowed system for iPad. They were almost just as opposed as adding full windowed control support to the iPad as much as they are historically to adding touchscreens on the Mac. And after all these years of resistance trying to tell us there was a different, better way to do that on the iPad that made more sense than the same controls that we just had on the Mac, well, they finally gave in and said, you know what? We already developed the perfect system for controlling multiple windowed apps. And yeah, it is the same system we've been using since 1984 to control the Mac. There is no need for them to be different. That willingness to give up on their very stubborn opinion is the same reason why I think they will give up on this stubborn opinion not to add touch controls for the Mac, because they gave up on the iPad. So why wouldn't they give up on the Mac? Why wouldn't they, if they're trying to combine, not really combine, I guess, just make these user interfaces work closer together, make them a little bit more seamless to transition to, then that would also mean if you're making windowed application support easier on the iPad, then of course you would also make touchscreen friendly controls that work on the Mac. Now, that is just my opinion, so is there any factual evidence to back this up? Well, there have been reports out there that Apple is exploring and even patenting ideas to bring touchscreens over to the Mac. Particularly, it seems that Apple may give us our first touchscreen Mac with a redesigned MacBook Pro that is supposed to come out sometime in 2026. This 2026 MacBook Pro would be the first Mac to use an OLED display. And that would also fix a major concern Apple has had about adding touchscreen displays to the Mac, and that is that it would actually make the lid of the Mac thicker. And you know Apple doesn't want to do that, but with an OLED display, there are already very thin display panels. So if they're adding these thin OLED display panels and then they put a touch layer on top of that, well, the lid probably wouldn't have to get any thicker based on the recent evidence with just how thin the OLED iPad Pros are. So when they are ready to add that OLED display, that would solve any problems they would run into incorporating touch controls on the LCD and mini LED panels they currently use. They won't have to make this lid any thicker. So a thinner MacBook Pro with an OLED display, with rounded corners, and there's another big feature laying right there in secret, a cellular modem. Yes, I also believe these new Macs will be the first fully connected cellular Macs on the market, thanks to Apple now having their own C1 modem. I think the phone app in macOS Tahoe is a good indication that they are planning to bring these cellular capabilities to future models. But yes, Apple's new unified design language, Liquid Glass, for all of its platforms spells more than just a new design change. It signals a broader converging of features and capabilities that will span across every single OS. And just like how the iPad is now a computer that can handle multiple windows just as well as the Mac, well, the Mac will be a place that can handle touch just as well as the iPad. But what do you think of the idea of Apple bringing touchscreens over to the Mac? Is this a feature you want? Is it something you're interested in? Or would you rather they just focus on other improvements? As always, if you like this video and you want to give me a like, see if I'm right, we'll know within like the next year if I'm right or wrong. So you can come back and dunk on me. But you can only do that if you're subscribed, I guess, because you can keep track of it. And then you can unsubscribe and be like, this guy was wrong. But thank you for watching. I appreciate you all. And I'll catch you in the next one. I'm pretty confident about this analysis. Touchscreens on the Mac. It's finally going to happen.